And now to China, as the country has accused the BBC of deliberately distorting facts to tarnish the nation's perception in the West after a BBC reporter was detained at a protest in Shanghai.
The remarks from the British side are a serious distortion of facts and constitute a grave interference in China's internal affairs. We firmly reject it. Everything was conducted within legal procedures. This BBC journalist refused to cooperate with the police's law enforcement efforts and then acted as if he were a victim. The BBC immediately twisted the story and massively propagated the narrative that its journalist had been arrested and beaten by police, while actually he was working simply to try to paint China as a guilty party.
China has said the BBC reporter was detained for refusing to leave the scene as it became potentially dangerous. The authorities released him after confirming his identity. They said the journalist didn't identify himself as such until after he was taken into custody. Protests have erupted in China after 10 people died in an apartment building fired during an anti-COVID lockdown. Those protests have received widespread support among Western countries and their allies, including the US, Japan, and Australia. Western governments which previously opposed anti-lockdown protests in their own countries are now speaking out in support of the demonstrations in China. Among them is Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, seemingly forgetting about his own harsh stance against similar protests in his nation earlier this year.
Obviously, everyone in China should be allowed to express themselves, should be allowed to share their perspectives and indeed protest. If you joined the protests because you're tired of COVID, you now need to understand that you are breaking laws. We've heard your frustration with COVID, with the measures that are there to keep people safe. We've heard you. It's time to go home now.
Major Western media outlets have also been changing their stance as the protests are no longer in Western countries, but are now in China. CNN described the Chinese rallies as a cry for freedom after previously accusing European demonstrators of being rule breakers. Also, the BBC branded COVID protesters as conspiracy theorists, as did Sky News, which is now presenting the Chinese demonstrators in a positive light. We heard from international criminal lawyer Christopher Black. He says it's common for the Western media to show China in a bad light.
They're using every pretext they can to put China in a bad light. Because you can be rest assured that if China had relaxed all its COVID measures and many people died in China, they would be accusing China of doing nothing to protect its people. The fact is that China is trying to protect its people as best it can and using measures which were effective and are effective. They're trying to undermine the Chinese government as they are trying to undermine the Russian government by supporting any small protests which they can then drive into something bigger to try and influence people in China against the government and try and support with the domestic populations the anti-Chinese policies they're adopting. I didn't see the Chinese government complaining about what the Canadian government did to the protesters then or since. So, as I say, any chance they have, the Canadians, the Americans, the British, and all the rest of NATO, any pretext they can use to bash China, they are going to use it, and we can expect more of the same. The hypocrisy is just staggering.